Hello and welcome to this second conversation on culture in the time of COVID, presented by the Asia-Europe Foundation and the Embassy of Switzerland in Singapore. My name is Anupama Sekhar, and joining me today are four guests from Singapore and Switzerland. Let's welcome Ms. Anna Arutyunova, the Head of Global Networks and International Affairs at Helvetia Zurich, Mr. Philippe Bischof, the Director of the Swiss Arts Council Helvetia, Mr. Yves Fischer, Deputy Director at the Federal Office of Culture Switzerland, and Mr. Paul Tam, who is the Deputy CEO of Planning and Corporate Development at the National Arts Council of Singapore. Thank you for taking the time to join us today. This afternoon and morning, we will be talking about the responses taken by federal ministries as well as arts councils in response to the impact of the pandemic on the arts. Let's begin in Switzerland. Mr. Fischer, may I turn to you to kickstart the conversation? How did the work of the Federal Office of Culture of Switzerland change in 2020? In the context of Switzerland, where culture is looked after at different levels, the federal, the canton, and the city, what kind of coordination mechanisms became important for both alignment and complementarity in the programs and policies presented? And what were the most important learnings for you in 2020? Mr. Fischer, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much and good afternoon, everybody. Allow me first to give you a few pointers on Switzerland and how it is organized, particularly as regards culture, because the distinctive Swiss structure has presented unique challenges and at the same time opportunities in the current crisis. It has conditioned the approach we put in place, and it will condition what can be achieved in the future, of course. As you may know, Switzerland is a federal state. It is organized on three levels. The Confederation, that means the national level, 26 cantons, representing the regional level, and over 2,000 political communes and/or cities. Federal involvement in cultural policy is confined to a small number of sectors, such as film, heritage conservation, languages, and cultural activities of national interest, including foreign affairs. According to the Swiss Constitution, the majority of competencies, including culture, lie with the cantons. As a result, each of the 26 cantons is in charge of establishing its own cultural policy and priorities. I should maybe say a quick word about Helvetia, also a main player in the cultural landscape in Switzerland, and today represented by its director, Philippe Bischof. Helvetia is an independent foundation under public law, receiving its funding from the Confederation. Its main responsibility is fostering cultural exchange within Switzerland as well as abroad, and my colleagues will tell you more about that. So this pyramid structure of cultural competencies is reflected in the associated final expenditure. The lion's share of the investments comes from the base. First, the cities and the communes, second, the cantons, and finally, the Confederation. And all this completed by substantial funding from the private sector. So this is a bottom-up policy, both politically and financially. So overall, the Confederation applies a strong principle of subsidiarity when it comes to culture. However, the Confederation has particular assets that give it a special advantage. It has an overview of cultural policies in Switzerland. It provides statistics to accompany the political debate. It sets the legal framework for the promotion of culture in Switzerland, and it can act, especially when it is in the national interest. And with COVID, of course, the national interest was obvious. Thus, to help the cultural sector, the federal government intervened on an unprecedented scale and was very quick to provide financial support. In mid-March already, it set up a program of non-refundable grants to cover the costs of events that were cancelled or postponed. It offered emergency funding to cultural practitioners, and it also supported amateur culture and cultural associations, which are important for preserving the Swiss cultural fabric. Given Switzerland's federal structure, cooperation between the different levels of government was crucial to establish a strong support system. That was also a part of your question. So coordination and exchange of information is ensured by what we call the National Cultural Dialogue. This political body brings together all layers of national cultural policymakers, confederation, cantons, communes and cities. And in the COVID crisis, this body has deployed its full potential and acquired great operational importance. It has enabled a rapid and in-depth exchange between all stakeholders, and this mechanism is particularly useful in overcoming the challenge of having so many interlocutors at so many different levels. The National Cultural Dialogue was an essential platform for coordinating and managing the COVID measures. And there was need for adaptation. Initially scheduled for 6 months, the program was extended until the end of this year. And the Confederation conducted a survey that established first that a third of the public does not plan to return to a cultural institution until the pandemic is over. And second, that the cultural sector will be fundamentally changed by this crisis. Dissemination of cultural content and the sector's relationship with the public will be transformed. This will be a challenge for all cultural practitioners, but also, for example, for Helvetia and the Federal Office for Culture. The Confederation has adopted by including support to transformation projects among its measures. This support aims to enable cultural enterprises to adapt to the new situation and to develop specific projects to win back their audiences. The Swiss cultural sphere has demonstrated creativity and imagination during the crisis by fully respecting the health protection measures put in place by the federal authorities to combat the COVID-19 pandemic. For examples, film festivals, such as the documentary film festival Vision du Réel in Nyon, and recently the Solothurn Film Days, have reacted creatively to the closure of cinemas by streaming their programs accompanied by discussions and virtual meetings. And the Zurich Opera House has come up with an ingenious plan to allow the performances of the 2020-21 season to take place with the orchestra in a remote rehearsal area and the choir in a different hall, being broadcast live from a large outdoor rehearsal sphere, thus maintaining distance while ensuring perfect sound production. Only the soloists appear on stage, allowing the audience to enjoy their performance directly in the theater or now at home. These are the types of projects that can be supported so that cultural institutions can resume their activity as soon as possible, while remaining prudent in terms of health, of course. Politically speaking, the crisis came at a pivotal moment. Every 4 years, a long-term strategy setting out cultural priorities and objectives is presented to Parliament. The crisis occurred precisely at the time when the cultural strategy for the next 4 years was submitted to Parliament for consideration. This raised a profound question: was the strategy still valid in light of the crisis? Did it respond to the new needs, or should we redefine it completely? There was an extensive debate, and a large number of options were considered. In the end, the Parliament decided that it was better to consolidate a solid and reliable basis for cultural actors and institutions and to build change on this basis. The idea was to avoid creating additional instability and instead to build on a proven system. The original strategy was therefore accepted, but it also leaves room for new developments. That will be really important for the near future. Many ideas are currently emerging on how to deal with the crisis, of course, also on a political level. I would like to stress the importance of bringing them to life at the political level, of course, because political consensus is the key to achieving any real progress and change and adaptation. And that is where finally the Federal Office of Culture comes in. So I give back the floor for your next questions and the next speakers. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Fischer. Let's continue with the Swiss story. And I turn now to Mr. Bischof and Ms. Arutyunova from Pro Helvetia. Pro Helvetia looks both at Switzerland and the world. In fact, more than about 60% of your budget is spent outside Switzerland. And Pro Helvetia has maintained for over 30 years or so a series of international offices, including now in Paris, Moscow, Shanghai, and Delhi. Interestingly, it's local staff who head up your international offices. In this unique context of Pro Helvetia, could you tell us how you transformed your policies and programs in 2020? Have some of your new schemes been evaluated? And what has been the biggest learning for Pro Helvetia with regard to the willingness and the ability of arts organizations to embrace change? Mr. Bischof, the floor is yours. We don't hear you, Mr. Bischof.
Sorry. Hello. Thank you very much for the invitation, and good morning, good afternoon to everybody. I will continue on what Yves Fischer has been explaining as a big framework for cultural policy in Switzerland, and try not to repeat what he was saying, but some of the things certainly also are valid for what we have been experiencing. That's very clear. But I really try to focus, and will then also hand over to Anna for what is regarding our offices abroad, just to describe maybe on two levels what we have been experiencing. It was for us very interesting to experience and to see that before funding activities, it became extremely important as an arts council to consult. Something we were not totally prepared for, honestly, because from the moment when COVID started and when the pandemic started to stop cultural activities and then to bring it to a lockdown, we got enormous calls, mails from people asking, what do we do now? From each levels. And this was really, I mean, it's something that is important to mention because it needs resources and competences. And this is also a very interesting experience. You were asking what were the learnings. We were learning enormously during that period, just from the questions, from the sorrows. And this certainly also will affect in the future our measures and our activities, because you're always in the risk of being a bit in the office, even though we are a lot in the field. And this is one learning we had, how important it is to exchange, to try to consult if possible, but also honestly say we don't know. We have to search for solutions together. But now coming back to the question of the promotional activities. I mean, for us, it was very clear from the very beginning of the pandemic that besides the measures Yves was explaining, what is the emergency aid, you can say, it was important to give signs that the creativity, but also dissemination could kind of continue. What is easily said in a time of pandemic. So all we tried to do was two things. We tried to adapt our measures, and I'll give you a very concrete example later on, always based on the question, what is our mandate and what is the objective of our mandate? So, example, we, amongst other things, are here to support Swiss artists for touring, promotional activities, dissemination activities within Switzerland and abroad. We knew this wasn't possible anymore. So we said, okay, we will support anything, like Yves said, for the film festivals, literature festivals, that will go online. We just tried. We don't know whether it will work, but we maintain the support, or we encourage to go into that direction. Interesting example was that, for instance, we felt very, very quickly that artists want to create, but there is a danger of creating too many projects in the same time. So we said it could be interesting to support them in research, to research for future projects. And this, for instance, was not a change. We have done that before, but we have strengthened that line in our activities. Afterwards, Anna will tell you about how we were dealing with residencies, because the residencies are an instrument tool for cultural exchange, for dialogue, for bridging between Switzerland and the world. I won't speak about that. And the second thing what we did was to launch specific calls. And there as well, I give you an example. We invented a call that was called Close Distance. Based on the idea, close distance, we would like to maintain cultural exchange, dialogue, but we cannot travel. And we invited by a call practitioners to bring in concepts, and then we try to support the most promising one, also and always in a kind of sustainable direction. We didn't want to support one-shots. We said we don't want to just support streams, and what was very important, we didn't want to support culture for free. That is a big problem with streams, that it's just free. It's nice for the moment, but for the artist, it's a financial problem. And we launched that call and had 600 applications. This was like triple of what we were expecting, what was the first learning and problem, because we learned that such a call, even though it is great opportunity, shouldn't be too wide and too open. This is stressful for everybody if it's too open. So one learning is to focus very clearly in specific calls. Secondly, we also learned, but this is a bit a contradiction in the system, that for the practitioners, it's in the same time an opportunity as a stress. They are suffering and they have to bring in innovation. You know, so how do you deal with that? Saying, yes, it needs a kind of convincing proposition, but it also has to respect the fact that in that very moment, the sorrows are maybe elsewhere. So being precise and being specific is one of the learnings. And maybe the last point before I hand over to Anna is that the hybrid became more important. And there also I give you a very beautiful example. We have been supporting a comic festival that has to be cancelled. And the festival called us saying, we have an idea. We would like to commission comic artists and make posters and spread them throughout 13 or 14 Swiss cities. Very traditional format, just posters in the public space. And we said, yes, that's a way to transform your festival, not digitally, in an analog way. And what was astonishing, that they had a reach out that was much bigger than the festival itself, because all of a sudden it was in many, many different cities. They could commission very directly artists by paying them, and we could support the festival. And this is also maybe another learning, that even though digital is extremely important, we'll talk about it later on, the analog and the dealing with analog, and that's why I say the hybrid between the two will be very important in the near future. And now I think it's interesting also to hear, to complete a bit the picture, how we were dealing with our offices and specifically with the residencies. Anna, if you want to take over.
Yes, thank you, Philippe. With pleasure, indeed. Like it has been mentioned, There are 6 liaison offices across the globe, and clearly for many liaison offices, mostly for all of the liaison offices, there has always been a huge focus on exchange programs, and residencies naturally is one format of the exchange programs, which helped to open doors, on the one hand, to the Swiss artists, to the cultural scenes internationally, but also to international artists and art practitioners to learn and exchange with the cultural scene in Switzerland. Clearly, in the time of the pandemic and restricted mobility, it was incredibly difficult to maintain the residency program in a way in which it has been always happening. And of course, it was a sort of moment of stress in a good way also for us to understand and to come up with a solution that will be meaningful for the artists and that will not interrupt a program which is highly valued from artists, from all the artists who have been or are participating in this programs. And so the very important thing was that while some of the residencies were clearly postponed because the projects, the ideas that the artists wanted to develop, they needed the physical presence of a person in a specific place. However, we were able to come up with a residency framework which was still able to offer artists possibility to benefit from substantial and resourced professional opportunity via digital way. So we basically came up with this idea of the residency, which was called Home Not Alone. It followed a very similar format to the regular studio residency, where the artist was supported to develop new directions in their practice during 3 months with financial and technical support from Helvetia. Normally, the artist who is coming to the residency is supported also accompanied by a coach who introduces the artist to the local cultural scene. And we decided to maintain this very important aspect of the residency exchange, and we called this person a critical friend from the country where the artist was supposed to go. So in the course of 3 months, the artist and his critical friend were in constant dialogue. And what was also only possible thanks to the digital format of this residency is that it was possible to create a sort of informal community among all the artists and all the critical friends who were simultaneously in those digital residencies. And this is something, for example, which is not actually possible when artists are physically coming to Switzerland. Everybody stays in different cities. So there is no really stimulus to create these sort of informal communities. Well, if I have 2 more minutes, I would probably just mention one project from an artist, just to give an example of what sort of projects were developed in the course of these digital residencies. For example, an artist from Congo, Serge Diakota, was working on a project, Dreams and Cohabitation, where originally he was supposed to come to Basel and to research on similarities and differences between the cultural and lived realities of Basel and Kinshasa. Clearly that was not possible, and what he did was instead recording a video where he invited all interested people with immigration experience to contact him directly and to talk to him for 15 minutes. And as a result, he created a sort of edited film, which was exactly speaking about different migrational experiences of people on cultural, social, and political level. But this is one of many examples, and I have to say there were a lot of beautiful projects created during this digital way of exchange. Thanks.
Thank you for sharing that. On this note, I'd like to turn to Singapore, where Mr. Tan and myself are joining you today. Mr. Tan, would you walk us through the journey of the National Arts Council of Singapore in 2020? From Switzerland, are there any similarities or differences with regard to the challenges faced by the arts community here in Singapore? What sort of unique responses were necessary to respond to local realities here? Mr. Tan, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Anupama, and thanks to all the previous speakers for sharing the situation in Switzerland. I think what struck me was actually how much we shared in common. I think a lot of the challenges are very similar. I think there's very little doubt that the pandemic has upended the arts and culture sector all across the world, whether it's the museums or the theaters, and Singapore is no exception. Maybe before I show the pictures, maybe I show the pictures a little bit later, yeah, if that's all right, yeah. I just wanted to just touch very quickly on what the Arts Council does. We're not as complicated as I think in Switzerland. We're smaller, we're a city-state, so the funding is done at a national level. So we at the Arts Council are the primary champion and funder of a lot of the arts companies and the artists here in Singapore. And of course, we want to grow audiences, I think like all other arts agencies around the world, because we believe that the arts touch people as individuals, can bring community together, and of course, fly the national flags, right? And I think that one thing that we certainly have in common, as I'm hearing, from the previous speakers, is how all of us have had to be quite agile responding to the pandemic. We've had to kind of test things. We've had to look at whether something can go physical, can go digital completely, whether it needed to take a more hybrid modality, and then we learn along the way, and then we adapt. I think that's something that we experience here in Singapore as well. Also, the idea of the focus on doing more research, the idea that residencies still remain important. I think these are takeaways that would be similar here in Singapore as well. What happened in Singapore was that there was a period when we had one lockdown. We're quite lucky. We have not had many waves. We've had basically one big lockdown in the middle of last year. And that's when everything was closed, and museums and theaters and concert halls. So it's quite serious. But I think the government was very quick to respond. First, let me talk about the national level. At the national level, there were many things being done. The two things I would highlight would be a job support scheme that basically is a wage subsidy scheme for all companies, right? And it's tiered according to how severely you are affected. So aviation and tourism were the most affected, so they were given a larger wage subsidy. But the arts and culture sector was the next tier, and that was at the 50%, which was really quite generous. So that was one very well appreciated scheme, which helped the arts and culture scheme stay afloat so that cultural workers did not have to be retrenched. Then, of course, we know that the sector has a lot of freelancers, and there was also a separate scheme for self-employed individuals, and that was at the national level as well. But of course, many arts and culture workers are independent freelancers, and that was also a kind of wage subsidy that was given over 9 months. And it came up to about 9,000 Singapore dollars, which is a useful sum, to tide during difficult times when there was very little work to be had. So I think where we are now is that we are now at a cautiously open position, and that's where maybe the pictures can come out. Just to give you a flavor of what's happening here in Singapore and what we've been busy trying to do, we've been trying to have some semblance of normality. So we have resumed busking. We've piloted some busking on the streets very cautiously. And the next couple of slides basically show you what it looks like. There's a distance between the performers and the audiences. That we even trialed out. This is the trial. We even put in an acrylic screen, as you can see, between the performers and the audiences. So this is on the street, it's in the open, and this was something we did late last year. So the next couple of slides will show that. So we're quite fortunate that we don't have, our community cases are quite low. We don't have a massive surge of infections in Singapore, and we're able to pilot experiments like this. And then, of course, once things are more stable, we will then see whether we can have a broader resumption of busking, just to use one example. The next couple of slides gives you an example of what performances look like. And you will see on slide 4, a concert. And that's actually very recently staged, just the last 2 weeks. And it's in our Esplanade Concert Hall. But as you can see, the performers are all very socially distanced. And even the audiences, as you will see in the next slide, in the darkness, there are audiences. So this is not just a digital performance. The next slide will show you the audiences seated in. You can just barely make it out. And these audiences are also socially distanced. So we are allowing quite conservatively some resumption of live performances capped at 250 audiences. And the people on stage are also capped as well. And right down to the detail of what kind of instruments they're playing. If you don't need to, if it's not a brass or wind, you have to put your mask on. So it's quite specific, the kind of safety management measures that we've had to try and have some resumption of live performances. Is also actually also some economic activity. So people can buy tickets, that there is some economic activity in the sector, but to do it in a safe and responsible way and aligned to the rest of the national measures. So one last point I'll make is that on top of everything I've described, the job support scheme and the wage relief for freelancers, there actually was a separate funding given to the Arts Council to help generate more arts activities during this last year. A lot of these activities you would imagine would be digital. A fair number of them are related to upskilling and trying to help our artists and arts companies use the opportunity, the downtime to think about new skills that they want to try and pick up or hone. And that was a separate funding of about US about $42 million. Singapore dollars is $55 million to generate some activity, a lot of commissions, a lot of funding going to the arts companies, a lot of training programs as well. And we are happy to say that in terms of job opportunity or gigs, as we like to say it, I think that funding funded up to 12,000 gigs, separate gigs, which I think was welcomed by the community and kept some level of activity so that the dancers can continue dancing even though they're dancing from home, right? And they get a chance to hone their craft. And there is some good content, fresh content for people who are stuck at home, or people who are being conservative and not traveling so much, so that there's some good quality arts and cultural content there to uplift their spirits. So I think with that in mind, with the things that we've put in place, we're in, fingers crossed, a relatively good place that we've been able to protect a fair number of our core talents in Singapore. And so that activities like what you're seeing now, the exhibitions, the activities in the galleries and the museums can continue on. But as you will see as well, and this might seem odd to maybe some other parts of the world, I understand your audiences are from everywhere. Generally, the posture here is that you keep a mask on, whether it's in the theater, concert hall, or in a gallery like this. I think I'll stop here and then we can have a further discussion. Yeah.
Thank you, Mr. Tan. I hope I'm audible. I'm having some technical difficulties here with my microphone. Thank you for sharing these perspectives from Switzerland and from Singapore. We have spoken about the slow return of hybrid and also the cautious return of physical gatherings here in Singapore. But I'd still like to talk a little bit about digital. Would you say that digital has by and large become the new public space? And what have been some of the biggest successes in terms of digital projects in keeping the arts alive in what has been a difficult year? And what is the most innovative digital project that you may have encountered in the last year, particularly with regard to international collaborations, which have long depended on travel and face-to-face encounters, and rightly so, but which are now particularly suffering due to the restricted mobility. Mr. Tan, could I turn to you for some examples from Singapore?
Thanks. I think with everyone else, the idea of trying to commission and get more digital content, I think everyone shares that. Trying to have artists who are not so familiar with the digital space pivot, and if it helps to have a kind of a financial incentive, a commission, I think that has helped. I would qualify that, there's also the risks, which I think was also highlighted by our Swiss counterparts, our Swiss friends, that there's a danger of putting too much content out, right? And that people may have a limited bandwidth to try and absorb all that stuff, right? All that good stuff, right? That's available online. So that's one of the challenges. I mean, we've often heard about screen fatigue, that perhaps that there's too much, we're working already from 9 to 6, and then for leisure you're also staring at the screen, right? Yeah, so I think that's one of the real kind of tensions that we have to grapple with. Although I would also say that if you think about it, very few people complain of Netflix fatigue. So how is that? Because the Netflix is also watched through a screen, right? So that's an interesting food for thought. I also wanted to put a cautionary note that as much as, the Arts Council believe that, we want to have a lot of digital content and help the artists think about this and pivot towards that, sometimes you have to think about the lower tech things as well. And that there are also parts of the audience that may not be so familiar with the kind of technological, whether it's VR or AR, which are all the newer things, in the technological space. So to share one example, we have a program which caters to seniors, right? And one of the insights that we found is that, we actually have got enough data after, running the programs for many years to start WhatsApp groups. So one effective way was actually, rather than try to give them information, on their Facebook, put out Facebook ads and all the rest of that, was actually to create these WhatsApp groups, have volunteers lead the WhatsApp groups, and then the content is shared through the WhatsApp groups, right? Like, guys, this is the link. So there's still some technology involved, but the delivery is different, right? And then also for those who may not have access to a device, what we did was then we worked with the social service organization to use MP3 devices. So the concerts are then pre-recorded, and then of course it's new content, but it's pre-recorded, and it goes through that using the MP3 devices to the audiences, working with the social service organizations, who then can identify people who don't have their own devices. So I think it's also important to stay agile, which I think is something that I think we've all gathered from the last year. Happy to hear how our Swiss friends have been able to tackle the challenges of digitalization.
Thank you, Mr. Tan. I'll turn to Mr. Bischof and Ms. Arutyunova. Are there digital projects you'd like to share with us and tell us more about?
Thanks very much. I can, just before giving you two examples and then handing over to Anna, say that I completely agree on what Mr. Tan was describing, on one hand as challenges, but also as opportunities. And I think what will be very important for cultural policy, and that's something I really want to say here, is that we accompany this process of hybridization, if we want, with a lot of understanding, with resources, because it needs competences. It needs not only the will to do it, that's one important element, but it needs budgets. It needs people who are able to do. So it needs time for the institutions to make the steps that are obviously extremely necessary. And what is very interesting, Mr. Tan's example of the WhatsApp group, sometimes there is very, very easy tools to be used in a different way. But still, and that's a critique I openly speak out here, that a lot of cultural institutions so far didn't want to use. I mean, that's something we really clearly have to say. But now coming again to the creativity, I can share with you two formats that have been invented or developed during the pandemic that I liked very much. Both being supported by us with a certain amount. The first one is something I found extremely impressive because it was a literature festival on Facebook. And literature basically is a discipline or a field where we would say this is hard to transform because it's the book, it's the voice, it's the text, etc. And this is a literature magazine called Glimmer, you can say, based in Berlin. It's Swiss and German people who publish a queer literature magazine. And they decided to invent a festival called Viral. And this was purely organized on Facebook. And the idea was very simple. They invited between 4 and 6 writers. They invited them for every time a lecture and a discussion, one after the other. That was it. Very simply, very high quality. And they were overwhelmed by the success. They kind of had to continue to do a second edition. And this for me was the perfect example of the simple way. And it was all filmed at home. And behind was a kind of sheet with written on Viral by the artist. And it was an interview and it was a lecture. Very beautiful. I personally discovered a lot of good literature. This was one example. And then maybe moving over to more complex, also technical and artistic projects. A project, I will share it in the chat afterwards with you, is called Mass Files. This is a project invented and realized by a Swiss artist, Veronika Spierenburg, who is usually traveling a lot, also doing residencies. And she was, as she couldn't travel and as she was in the middle of a project, she was creating an online archive of auditory urban landscapes that were captured around the globe. She invited sound recordists and artists to record 30 minutes sound in the city or the place they live. And she was putting it one by one on a website. So it's like you can see it's a mapping, it's a geography, it's a sound archive. It is in the same time very local. You listen to it where you are, but it's in the same time very global, but it's connecting the world. And this again was an example of using existing technology, and this is what I said in the beginning, it needed a lot of technical skills. She's a hyper-professional artist, and this is not to underestimate. I stop here because there will be plenty of VR projects, etc. But I find both examples sustainable, very close to the audience, and also really trying to interconnect, let's say, the local and the global.
Thank you. Thank you very much for sharing those very inspiring examples. We are already beginning to get some questions from our audiences regarding some of the ideas you have shared. We have a question from the Department of Foreign Affairs of the Philippines, who are very excited that Singapore is cautiously returning to physical arts events and are wondering, do you set a target number for these audiences, and have you reached them, and what has been the experience of your audience? Do you have feedback already from your audiences? And we have a question from Kenny Uy in Malaysia, who's asking, how does the Arts Council or agencies responsible for culture, how do they ensure that the public will feel comfortable enough to return to public spaces, given the climate that we are in, when they would actually be more comfortable to simply sit at home and turn on their screen? So how could we incentivize them to step out again? Mr. Tan, would you have any comments at this stage to respond to these questions?
Yeah, all right. Thanks, Anupama, and thanks for the questions. I would say that we're still in the early days of resuming live performances. Essentially, there is a maximum capacity of 250 for shows, but even then, your venue might sit 500 or 700, but you still need to ensure the basic safety distances. So I won't go into all the mundane details, but the people who run venues have got, I think, a fairly a comprehensive, standard operating procedure to follow. I would like to think that kind of standard operating procedure actually gives people some measure of reassurance, right? That, things are in place, that there is, some thought being put into the safety measures, right? And that there's also monitoring. So on top of venues doing what they're supposed to do, there's also an extra layer of ambassadors or enforcement officers potentially, keeping an eye to make sure that the venues, some of which are private, are also adhering to the advisories and the guidelines. So I would like to think that that gives some assurance. Of course, the Arts Council can try and do the public messaging and even marketing campaigns to remind people that the arts are an essential part of our lives and that people should support the arts. But I think the decision has to be made on an individual level. And I think different people have different levels of comfort when it comes to going to a venue. I would say that generally there has been a pent-up kind of feeling in Singapore, at least, to want to attend cultural events. So when those shows go out, the tickets are snapped up very quickly, right? But I think it's also a function of the climate. I mean, because the community cases currently in Singapore are very low. I mean, we've had single digit the week before, and I think it's been 0 for the last few days. So I think that gives the extra confidence for a lot of Singaporeans to venture out. And you have to wear a mask throughout the entire concert. So it's a bit of a trade-off, right? You know that there are shows out there, you know that you can enjoy them, but you know that there are certain safety measures which you have to play your part in as well. And I think that's likely to be the case for the months coming ahead. I will highlight one challenge. I mean, it's not all hunky-dory and blue skies. Obviously, when you reduce the audiences, and we don't have clarity how long we'll have to keep this up for, it also means that your costs, your whole business model is different, right? Your revenues are compromised, they're different. So it potentially means that ticket prices may have to go up, that companies have to think a lot harder about fundraising. And of course, government has to think about then how much it has to support the arts. So those are very difficult decisions for any of us in the cultural policy space. But it might also mean that even if the government is prepared to support and businesses try to pivot, as with any other sector, there will be some people who will fall out of the ecosystem because it's just not sustainable. And I think we see this in all other sectors, right? Whether it's F&B or whether it's tourism and aviation. So I think arts and culture will not be spared.
We also have, thank you, Mr. Tan. We also have a question about the future of residencies, because we shared a few examples in this conversation. So the question is from Thomas Keller, who asks, do you know of any projects that are hybrid residencies that combine the digital and the on-site experience? And do you think that residencies will transform dramatically in the coming years, and on-site residencies, will they even be possible at all? Any thoughts?
Can I just quickly make a point from Singapore? I
Sure.
think residencies are absolutely important. I haven't spoken very much about it. But you see, it's got to do with the kind of travel regulations that each country has. So currently, it's very, very difficult for people to travel, to come into Singapore, to leave Singapore, right? Or people are reluctant because they are, you may have to serve a home quarantine and all the rest of that. So I think it's made any kind of hybrid kind of residency actually very difficult. I would like to think that digital residencies are not a bad option. I think we certainly should explore that option. I think sometimes a crisis like this forces you to be innovative and to actually also make do. I think the one caveat I'll put is that if you have an existing relationship with a foreign artist, you guys have worked before, it's actually much easier. You have a long-standing relationship, you know what each other's practice is about, you can collaborate. I think the challenge is trying to bring new players and you yoke them together. No matter how you try to matchmake, I think the risks are higher, and that's one of the realities. But we need to keep, and I'm sure you all agree, we all need to keep those kind of bilateral and multilateral conversations going, because I think that's what the arts is all about. Yeah.
If I may jump in and try to quickly answer, I think there's still a lot to be done and a lot to be discussed about how the residencies will change or will not change. Of course, I absolutely agree with Mr. Tan that currently it is difficult to say definitively, and I'm absolutely sure that once that travel regulations will be dropped one day, hopefully sooner than later, of course, it's impossible to say that no physical offline residencies won't happen anymore. I personally think that the hybrid residencies is a very interesting road to go. I also want to mention that there were already examples of projects supported by PREDIT where this hybridization, let's say, was tried out. It was not in the framework of the residencies, but it was rather in the framework of workshops and let's say artistic laboratories, when artists from other countries were represented by local artists in a role of sort of avatars. So they were kind of acting on behalf of artists who could not be present in a room, but then transmitting their experience. And I think this is per se in itself is extremely interesting moment, because this is what a dialogue is. It's not only about showing the results, but it's really about finding how we work together, how artists want to say about what they are doing. So I think it's a very interesting road to go. I think it's one of the roads to go, and I personally also won't that offline residencies disappear, for sure. But we can explore together. I'm sure about that.
Maybe to add one other element I find very interesting in that discussion, and it's also an experience we could make, is that usually a residency is something quite intimate. That's the idea. It's for an artist, for artists to be somewhere, to research on, to discuss, meet people, etc. We had experiences of home not alone residencies in which discussions between artists and curators were organized that would take place, let's say in Bogota, Colombia, and Rio. They were organized by Zoom and open to the audience. And that's something I find very interesting, because for me, always a residency is full of potential, of knowledge, of experience. And I regret very often, personally also, that I cannot be part of, to be the little mouse being there and experiencing and specifically opening it and say, that's to be shared. This also could be an interesting future. So I totally agree with what was said. It will be both, and the challenge is to find the good mixes.
Thank you for that. We are running out of time, so I'm going to turn to you all for a round of quick predictions. What would the arts look like in the next 3 years, particularly international cultural cooperation? And I'm also going to tie in with some questions that are coming in. We have a question from Hiroko Friedman, who's from the UNESCO Expert Facility. She's based out of Japan, who's asking about what could and should we be doing for the young artists, those who are just entering the field now and are faced with these seemingly insurmountable challenges. What could be special measures for young people in the arts? And also from Hans van der Bund, who's from the Asia-Europe Museum Network. He's asking about the biggest negative impact that the current restricted mobility will have on international cooperation. So some predictions from you on what the future will look like in the short to medium term. Could I start with you, Mr. Tan?
Oh dear, this is a very tall order. You know, crystal ball gazing is so difficult. I will hazard, and I'm sure I will live to regret what I'm saying. 1 year from now when I look back, I will say that there will be a shake-up in many of the arts and culture companies all around the world as they try to figure out what the new business model is, because I don't think this pandemic will resolve itself anytime soon. As we can see, even when the vaccine came out, there was a little bit of good news, but we know that the actual implementation is not so straightforward. And then you can get reinfections again, right? You could have people coming into the country, and then another wave starts. So with all these risks, I think even if arts and culture spaces were to open, the kind of business that you would do, the revenue streams would be different. So like it or not, I think there will be some challenges, there will be some realities there. I would like to think that artists being people who are thinking deeply about humanity and where we are. So I don't want to end I don't want to be all pessimistic. I would like to believe that our artists all around the world are creative and resilient, And they will find a way to respond to this pandemic in their art making that will inspire us, that will make us reflect and give us hope. And that because of that, that kind of multilateral, bilateral conversations will continue, and that you'll be creative around it. So maybe in some pockets, people will figure out, you know, that we can travel. I think Singapore and New Zealand possibly, you know, next couple of months, you know, hopefully New Zealand, which has got quite fairly good control of COVID, you know, could be a realistic place where we could start those kind of bilateral conversations. Just to give one example, where there could be bubbles formed, you know, based on travel, and then the cultural exchanges can come from there as well. And that will then, you know, keep all our arts globally, you know, interesting and resist something which is all inward-looking and nativist, and remind us that we're all connected to one big humanity. Must end on a happy note, right? On a more positive note.
Thank you, Mr. Tan. Mr. Fischer, could I turn to you for some thoughts?
Yes, from a governmental point of view, I would like to stress once again the importance of winning back the public. As it was mentioned, we saw many interesting examples, because their behavior will be a determining factor for the future of the cultural sector. And it's an economic factor we already talked about. And it's not certain that the public will want to return completely to the pre-crisis normality and reality. So there are important changes going on. Some of them have already acquired new habits, and they have new expectations, of course, and we have to be flexible to adapt these new expectations. That also means that we need to find a way, especially in the Swiss system, of subsidiarity, coming back and working back again. The federal level is currently providing emergency assistance, and it is the only entity capable of doing that. But it is now important that the cantons, communes, cities, and also, and I would like to stress this factor, the private sector support the new normality and the arts again or going further on. In recent months, some of actors have already adapted, as already mentioned, but there is more to do. Investments must follow. Important investments in new methods, new formats. So that means adaptation for sponsors, new uncertainty. And this is the only way culture can come off live support and start a reality and real life again. The transformation of the cultural world must come from the bottom up and must be accompanied by all levels of government actors, as well as I mentioned, the private sector. And the private sector, as the creative sector itself, has a key part to play in continuing the support of culture and bringing back about the essence to our lives. Philippe Bischof mentioned the importance of consultation and interaction. And for us as a government and body, it's of course important to be in phase of the needs. And of course, here Helvetia has a very important role. He's close to the cultural practitioners. He's in the field, he's an important sensor. And we are experiencing a narrow collaboration and exchange with Helvetia. It's very important to us as a federal authority. We on our side, we have the links to cultural associations, lobby organizations, because it's important to maintain and rise every day again political awareness of the situation, to create a political momentum, to continue financial support, legal framework support, and so on. So there's a lot to do from a structural, infrastructural, and funding point of view, from a funding and political perspective. But I give back the floor for the more field and concrete measures to coming up from the main actors in this pandemic.
Mr. Bischof or Ms. Arutyunova, the floor is yours. Whoever would like to go first.
Well, thanks a lot. I think we are very, very short in time, so I try to be really extremely short myself, Just to add 3 elements. For me, the first thing is to confirm what Yves was describing, that all active people in the cultural sector don't try and wait for the return of the so-called normal. I think we have to accept that there will be changes. They can be hard. We hope not too much, but I think it's important to go into that transformation and to use it as a chance, even though it may be difficult at the moment. Second thing, what I find very important, I pick up the question from this lady, thank you very much, about the upcoming artist. I think there it is 2 things for me are very important, that we very clearly explain to them and inform them about the possible future of the economic cultural system. To really get out of this logics of you will do it, you will make it, you will have success, you will tour, and it's all possible. We see it's a bit more complicated. There is a lot of precarity in the system. And I think we have to inform young people at the high schools better about the reality of the art market. And then secondly, to accompany them, and that's what I said in the first part, not only with supports for producing, but also for research, for dialogue, for discussion. I find that extremely important. And third, for me, important is that the notion of transdisciplinarity will get a stronger position in the art field, not as a critique of the disciplinary, but just again as a way to integrate other realities, maybe to open up to new forms of collaboration. And Mr. Tan said it also, that the importance of collaboration is always very, very obvious in culture, but I think it will be even more important as we don't leave the pandemic completely. We know that. So we have to stress really this notion of transdisciplinarity and new formats or new forms of collaboration. Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Arutyunova, would you like to add? Oh, you have about a minute. I'm sorry for that.
Yes, I will jump in very quickly and try not to repeat what has already been said, with which I agree to great extent. I think what is crucial in the coming months or years is to really focus on research and process. And I very much support what Mr. Tan has said, that the answer might and should come also from the artists. And I think on our side, what is important is to really create these structures and frameworks that allow them to come up with this answer. Because I also strongly believe that the question of the public and how to gain back the public will be then answered also in that process. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that. Alas, we are out of time, but if I could dare to summarize some of the key things that I have heard here this evening, the main thing is that the funders in this changing situation have to remain agile and open to change. At the start of the pandemic, about a year back, as Mr. Bischof said, it was important for funders to reassure the arts community that creativity is still possible. But the other side of the coin is that perhaps there were too many projects, perhaps there were one-off projects, perhaps care was sometimes not taken to adapt to those who are not too comfortable with digital. There was also the danger of making culture free and available, and this then impacts the artists who do not receive fair wages. Analog is still not lost, as we have seen from the beautiful example of the comic festival, and hybrid is perhaps the way to go in future. It is still important to have a local element, so we are not able to travel and have those immersive experiences we once did in international cooperation. This could be done through local anchors and local communities who digitally could still provide the local insights, knowledge, and experience. Critically for funders, it is a time to be open and to listen, to also respect the struggles that the arts community is going through. So perhaps a time for new competencies for arts managers and administrators who not only provide funds and opportunities, but really accompany the artists through these uncharted waters and focus more on process than just on the output, something that we have been talking for a long time in the arts. The changes in cultural practice, they seem to be something that will be fundamental. So we have to prepare for a reset. There are downsides to this reset and risks that we will face. Ticket prices may go up as arts organizations and venues face revenue losses. Are we, as the public, ready to pay for this? New business models must be investigated. The role of the private sector has to be strengthened. We've also seen that it's easier to collaborate digitally with those that we already know. So the risk of collaborating digitally with new partners may not always go down well. But again, this is an investment in process. There will be vulnerable groups, as we see in all sectors. Some people may not cope and adapt, and some parts of the arts community may perhaps fall out, and there has to be a focus in terms of reskilling them for perhaps new roles in our society. And last but not the least, with our public now having new expectations and new habits, it will also be a challenge to sometimes win them back for the years ahead. So on this note, a big thank you to all our speakers and to all of you listening in today. From the Asia Europe Foundation and the Embassy of Switzerland here in Singapore, thank you. And a quick advertising for the Asia Europe Foundation. Our travel grants have, of course, gone digital. We will be opening our digital mobility first open call on the 1st of February. So do apply. This is open to Asians and Europeans, individuals and organizations to work in small groups between 2 and 6. So please watch out for that on our social media channels. Thank you so much for joining us. Stay safe. And until next time, it's goodbye from Switzerland and Singapore.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.